Welcome back, and many thanks for staying with us right here on the #1 breakfast show in the country, Morning at NTV. It gives me absolute pleasure knowing that you didn't actually switch the channel and you're still watching NTV Uganda. We do actually appreciate the love and support that you've accorded us for the last 2 years moving forward. Well, let's talk about corruption and the real cost of the same on this economy. Out of the budget of 44.5 trillion Uganda shillings, 22 trillion is being swindled. That's half of the budget that is actually being swindled by unscrupulous individuals within government. So what is the real cost of this corruption on our economy? Remember, out of the 44.5 trillion budget, 21 trillion is going to be coming from taxes. They are going to be taxing individuals in this country who are not being even helped to resuscitate their businesses. I'm talking about the small and medium-sized enterprises in that regard. So it's a convolution of many negative factors that are going to be leading to the collapse of this economy. But mainly, corruption is at the front of all these problems. So Gilbert Sendugwa, the Executive Director for Africa Freedom of Information Center, is already here to talk about how bad the situation is. A very good morning, Gilbert.
Good morning, and good morning, dear listeners and viewers. Very pleased to be here.
Indeed. I don't even have to spell it out for you, Gilbert Sendugwa, how bad it is. Out of the budget of 44.5 trillion, 22 trillion is being swindled. That's already a recipe for disaster. But let's explain to the viewer how bad it is and how it will translate into a collapse of an economy.
Yes, the Inspector General of Government announced this week that over 22 trillion is lost every year through corruption. This is a very big concern. This is a lot of money because, as you have said, you know, our budget is 44.5 trillion. About 1/3 of that goes into debt servicing. A significant portion, over 10 trillion, goes to public, about running public services, including salaries, public administration. So what that means, therefore, is that what is left to provide services to the people is very negligible. Now, this has always been the case that officials speak of corruption as a problem. Every year, the Inspector of Government goes to Parliament to talk about the same thing, but nothing happens.
Nothing ever happens, but of course we are here talking about the same, the IGG report, and government official X who is watching Morning at NTV right now. I think it is Gilbert Sendugwa and Romy Busiku who are bathing these figures, talking about 22 trillion Uganda shillings. But of course this was inculcated within the IGG report. Ziwa did actually investigate the story. Let's show you some of the areas that were cited as most likely to lead corrupt tendencies. Take a look.
The Inspector General of Government, Betty Kamya, has painted a very scary picture, indicating in no uncertain terms the magnitude of corruption in the country. Over 20 trillion shillings is lost annually, according to the Inspector of Government Integrity Survey report. In her report handed over to the Speaker of Parliament, Jacob Olanya, Betty Kamya noted the areas worst affected by corruption.
When you think about 20 trillion, you really feel sick. It really means that the ordinary person who should have benefited from 20 trillion, that's why Uganda is hanging backward as it is.
Statistics. There's that old woman who has been cheated. She's not a statistic. So please don't tell me we have handled 500 cases when this one of these old women who has nothing has never been handled.
In taxation, 130 billion shillings is lost annually. In user fees and public utilities, 459 billion. Natural resources, 820 billion. Environment degradation, 15.4 trillion. Absenteeism in public sector, 2 trillion. Health and education provision, 451 billion. Security provision, 86 billion. Procurement and budgeting, 590 billion, among other sectors. Despite this worrying trend, in the last 4 years, government has not been appropriating funds for investigations, prosecution and recovery of assets to the Office of the Inspectorate of Government. Instead, the IGG's office has been relying on foreign donors, such as the Democratic Governance Facility, whose activities were frozen by government early this year.
Indeed, as of now, due to the standoff between government and the Democratic Governance Facility, GDF, all foreign funders suspended funding for IG activities.
But the Speaker of Parliament, Jacob Olanya, cautioned coming about a tough battle ahead, since corruption has penetrated the moral fabric of the country.
Because then you find them in your houses, they corrupt. You find them in your churches and mosques, they corrupt. You find them in your families, some are your parents, some are your brothers, some are your spouses. Who are the corrupt? Some of them are not even Ugandans.
The 2020 Corruption Perception Index by Transparency International ranked Uganda as the second most corrupt country in East Africa and 142 out of the 180 ranked countries globally. Herbert Ziwa, NTV at Parliament.
That is a recipe for disaster. A 44.5 trillion shilling budget, and you're losing 22 trillion to unscrupulous individuals who have no heart for this country. Let's break it down with Gilbert Sendugwa. He's still here. He is the Executive Director, Africa Freedom of Information Center. Let's talk about this and more. Do you think the corruption that we are seeing right now was precipitated or still continues to be precipitated by the void at the IGG's office? The fact that there was no leadership for the last 4 years, could that have been the reason as to why we are seeing corruption at its peak in Uganda right now?
Yes, obviously this is one of the reasons, but considering that even before the last 4 years, you know, corruption was very high, then other factors has to be looked into.
Indeed.
And these include, among others, when you don't have independent media, when the civil society are not independent,
Shrinking civic space.
and are not allowed to perform their work independently, or are stifled by way of restricting the resources that they have, then it becomes a problem. Let's look at the community level. Every day, on a daily basis, there is work going on in every community, in every corner of this country. We recently had a public dialogue in Ntungamo where the chairman of LC1 said that on a daily basis, he sees things going wrong on government projects. Either materials are being stolen, either shoulder work is being executed on the ground, but then he does not have information on what is taking place. He does not have a copy of the contract. He's not informed that he has a role to play and where to report when he has suspicion. Now, this is not limited to this chairman. It spreads across the country. And if these things are going wrong on every government project across the country on a daily basis, then, government will continue to lose money through these corrupt tendencies. So what is needed, therefore, is government to ensure that the media is free, independent, and able, to report when these malpractices happen. That civil society are free, independent, well-funded, and government sees them as part and parcel of the fight against corruption to help it achieve
and of
its
course,
mandate.
Gilbert Sendugwa, Nation Media Group has not shied away from these conversations on corruption. We've really thrown our weight behind the citizens to ensure that anything that has corruption tagged to it, we actually, yes, shine a light on it and, make sure that the viewer is well acquainted with what is happening within the country. For civil society, this shrinking space, the shrinking civic space has been so dire in that so many of the NGOs have been shut down. Over 54 NGOs have been shut down in this country, and these are NGOs that were actually operating in the spheres of governance and accountability. What does that say about a government that is shutting down NGOs that are actually shining a light on what is happening within the areas of governance, and especially accountability? This is where corruption is taking root. So why would you be adamant to let such organizations run unless you are the purveyor of corruption as a government?
Yes, one has to think of why are these organizations being targeted?
Indeed.
You know, from 2016, the NGO Act, introduced a lot of regulations that NGOs have to comply with. Then the funding, is suspended. Then media is not free. Sometimes, you make some findings on issues, and then, you don't see anything in the media. And when you follow up, they say, there are concerns, there are constraints that we cannot do. And nowhere in the world has corruption been fought successfully when there is citizens lack information, when citizens are not trusted, when the media is not independent and free. Now, on the other hand, institutions like the Inspectorate of Government also have a major role to play, but they cannot play this role when they are not trusted. Uganda has a Whistleblower Protection Act since 2010, but in 2014, the Honorable Deputy Inspector General of Government said the President is the biggest whistleblower. Look, when does the President get to be asked to pay bribes? Now, if this institution can build trust and confidence of ordinary citizens to be able to report it when there are issues, malpractices, then that will be a major issue. Then also,
there's a big problem here, Gilbert Sendugwa, because you're talking about reporting of the cases. The President has been reported too. He gets this information. The President one too many times will come out and say, I have a list of the bad people, but I do not have evidence. Now, doesn't that translate into how tough a job it is for the IGG's office? If the President himself knows the individuals, but he has no evidence, how tough is it for the IGG's office and this fight against corruption?
Yes, the people who have the evidence are the people who are made to pay bribes on a daily basis.
I hear you.
So, the same way the IG is, creating space to receive complaints from the President, that should be expanded to get the citizens to get the confidence to report. And the other issue is that the IG complained that Parliament lacks interest in the reports that the Inspectorate submits to Parliament. Now, this is a major concern because there is need for political will and leadership, which government, through Parliament, can impose. If, for example,
when you say Parliament rejecting these reports, are we talking about the NRM-leaning politicians within Parliament? Because I'm sure opposition would throw its weight behind such a report of 22 trillion shillings, saying, well, it is believable.
The thing is that what the IGG has said is that their reports for 4 years have never been discussed by Parliament.
Because there was never a leadership at the IGG's office.
No,
I think that's one of the reasons.
Even without leadership, Parliament receives these reports. But the fact that it does not take interest to read and discuss these reports and make decisions based on this report is a major area of concern, which obviously will reduce the Inspector of Government to being a complaining institution.
Would you blame the politicians in negating the significance of a report that has no investigations tagged to it? Because with the absence of leadership at the IGG's office, it meant that the tribunal couldn't expedite investigations into these corrupt tendencies or even hold to account these individuals. All they could do is just bath a report that was just clearly a report and then hand it to Parliament. So what would parliamentarians do with it?
You see, in this
if there's
report,
no evidence being tagged to those corrupt individuals.
You see, the IG is a clever politician. His office gets billions every year, but then her report says corruption is rising. And what does he say? She shifts the blame to Parliament and say, look, the problem that you know, this war is not being won is because you give me money for salaries, you give money for office, and even she talked about building a new building, but you have not given me money to investigate and prosecute cases. It's the work of Parliament to appropriate. So why should, for example, Parliament get money or government get money to build buildings, but then no money for investigations? The mandate, the core mandate of this institution is to investigate and prosecute cases of corruption. So appropriation should be aligned to mandate.
Thank you.
And when Parliament is not discussing these reports, it's a major area of concern.
I hear you.
That the Speaker and Parliament should take interest and address. But also, Parliament has to recognize, and the government has to recognize, that there cannot be progress in the fight against corruption when media is not working independently.
Except the NMG. Go ahead.
When
yes,
when
civil society
is being muscled, when citizens don't feel confident, the fact that the president is the biggest whistleblower, and yet it is ordinary people who on a daily basis are being forced to pay bribes, but these people are not reporting in spite of the law and in spite of the institutions, then there's a problem.
And of course, Gilbert Sendugwa, there is a big problem, a situation of despair indeed. If the president is getting the information that person X, Y, Z are involved in corruption and is saying, I don't have evidence to actually get them, why not remove them from office and investigate? Is there political will to actually root out corruption within this country? Is the situation redeemable, or should we just simply shut up, stop talking, because for every 20,000 Uganda shillings within this economy, 10,000 is acquired illegally?
Yes, you see, the president has several times that, you know, he has the will to fight corruption. And in 2016, he termed that term between 2016 and 2021 as Hakuna Mchezo.
I hear you. The chorus.
But now, from the IG report, when he says that their reports have been ignored, not discussed, that they are not given funds, then you ask yourself, what happened to this presidential, you know, pronouncement that this important institution has no money, has no, its reports are not considered, and above all, that this important institution can be there without leadership for a very long time. Then one, you know, has to ask whether, you know, something happened after the president's pronouncement or not.
Go ahead.
Yeah, because president has a social contract with the people based on manifesto. Now, if every year 20 trillion is taken away from that program of implementing the manifesto, then it undermines significantly the ability of the president and the government to fulfill that social contract.
I hear you, Gilbert Sendugwa, the Executive Director, Africa Freedom of Information Center. Let me use this analogy. Mr. Gilbert Sendugwa, you have 12 members in your household. You are the head of the family. Now, sugar goes missing, beans go missing, cassava goes missing, then you know, pinpoint and say, you know, elder girl, I want you to actually lead an investigation to find out what is actually happening. Who stole the sugar, who stole the beans, who's stealing all the cassava? And this is what happens. This person will investigate and come up with a report and simply give you a report and say, sugar is missing, beans are missing, cassava is also missing. But in the report, they're not mentioning who stole the sugar. They're not mentioning who stole the beans, and they're not mentioning where the cassava went, but they're just simply mentioning what you already know, that things are missing in your house. And that's largely what is coming in from the IGG. Large and fair, Gilbert, what needs to be done to root out corruption within our country?
You see, the former IG complained, you know, towards the end of her term, that corruption was, she put it that corruption was made in the highest office. Those are her words. And
So the powerful leaders are the ones who are corrupt.
that's what the IGG said.
Yeah, okay.
So if that is the case, then understandably, you know, it will be a difficult job for anyone in that office.
Are you saying, and is she also saying that we know who the corrupt leaders are, but we are just shying away from actually pinpointing them because they are too powerful?
Yeah, you know, this is a difficult issue because we have been seeing statements from the inspectors of government and statements from the president. You know, the president a few years ago asked, where did the IGG go? And as a result, he appointed a special unit, anti-corruption unit in his office. Then, you know, about a year later, we see the IGG saying the corruption is made in the State House, that thieves are hiding in the State House. And then the decision is there without leadership.
So the investigators need to be investigated.
Then you see the decision has no money according to the IGG report. So I think there's a conversation that is needed between those two offices.
And the people
but the big question is, if in the understanding of the president, you know, the IGG go to us, he said, where did it go? And he put a solution by establishing a unit. But even after that unit, now the inspectorate comes up and says that actually the problem has become bigger in spite of this unit, in spite of the inspectors of government, in spite of all the other efforts. So then it paints a very difficult picture that every citizen, every stakeholder in this country needs to discuss and say, so what?
So if the IGG is failing, the other organizations, civil society, who would have actually helped fill that void, are seeing a clampdown coming in from government, who are saying, no, please don't focus too much energy on governance areas, don't focus too much energy on the accountability spheres. Are we in such a state of despair that we just need to shut up and let this conversation on corruption go, because the leaders, who are supposed to be the purveyors of justice, are the ones involved in this corruption?
You see, officially the government has not said that, you know, these NGOs are being closed because they are fighting corruption.
Because they are shining a light in the areas of governance and accountability. Accountability has a lot to do with corruption, meaning those individuals, leaders in government, don't want these people to investigate. So that's why some opposition people are saying it might have been a deliberate effort to ensure that there was no leadership at the IGG so that all these corrupt tendencies could go on uninvestigated, and those other people who are in civil society helping to fill that void are also being muzzled. So if that's not the case, why would you clamp down on such people who are doing good for the nation?
You see, I mean, all these questions are difficult questions to answer, and the problem is in, you know, when there is a lot of discretion.
Indeed.
That, you know, a person at the various levels has discretion. If there is a complaint, for example, that maybe, for example, on the issue of the standoff between the DGF and the government, that maybe money is being spent in areas government thinks that inappropriate.
Areas of poverty alleviation?
No, I mean, government, I think the complaint was that, I think the allegation was
advancing social services in health.
I think the government was not complaining that DGF was supporting advancement of social services, but rather allegations of that some of their grantees were alleged to be supporting political opposition. Now, let's say that is the case. Why shouldn't that be investigated and addressed in a month or two? If every decision is going to take years, you know, just to resolve, then even corruption is going to be difficult to address.
But as far as the Africa Freedom of Information Center is concerned, what is the magic bullet? What is the recipe that could help us alleviate this challenge?
You know, my view, and especially in the context of Uganda,
yes, Gilbert,
leadership matters.
Indeed.
So the direction that the leadership points determines everything else. We have seen where, you know, the president has said this is a priority. In a matter of weeks, you see movement, serious movement of the whole government in that direction. I think that's what the president needs to do. Now more seriously than declaring a war against corruption. Second, the government has to recognize that the fight against corruption is not just a war of the inspectors of government alone, but a war of the people.
It needs
People have to be at the center of this. So
and that is civil society.
Civil society, every citizen, you know, has to play a role. The chairman in Ntungamuhu said that on a daily basis, he sees things going wrong. And probably all LC1 chairpersons across the country are important stakeholders. But if you have a project in their LC, but the LC chairperson has no copy of the contract, the school chairman management committee has no copy of the contract, the head teacher has no copy of the contract, and this is a problem because they cannot do anything because they don't know what this contract is supposed to deliver.
All right. A situation of despair. Thank you very much. Gilbert Sendugwa, he is the Executive Director, Africa Freedom of Information Center. Kind regards to the organization and thank you for the good work you're doing as far as information dissemination is concerned.
Thank you very much.
Well, the most disheartening bit about this conversation pertains to the fact that these 22 trillion shillings is still going to be paid by Ugandans. According to the government, they have a plan to actually squeeze money in form of taxes out of you. They are planning to get 21 trillion Uganda shillings out of the 44.5 trillion shilling budget in that regard, meaning it's you and I who are going to be paying for the corrupt tendencies of individual acts. Government needs to clamp down on corruption or else this country is still pretty much in tatters. Romeo Busiku is my name. Return shortly.